Anyway, let me welcome you all to this third webinar of the series of on improving India's competitiveness for inclusive economic growth. We've had two excellent events over the last 2 months, and we hope to conclude with this event today, and then finally to do an outreach event. All of the panelists have received a draft white paper we had produced, which is in the form of a slide presentation. It resulted from discussions as well as two catalytic papers or interventions by Amit Kapoor and Pritam Banerjee. Now, before I request Amit to kick off, one thing which I've noticed while working with the government for many, many years, having been in various committees doing this, that, and the other, that usually the recall of institutional memory is very poor, if at all. Often discussions which have been held are not referred to in the sense that it can actually help us to continue with the discussion rather than to start afresh and often reinvent the wheel. The only good report which I saw with good sort of catch up of all the past work was the Vivek Debroy's panel on railway modernization, where he looked at various recent, about 4 or 5 of those reports, and also commented on them in terms of preparing this own report. Now, one of the interesting projects which was done on this particular competitiveness, or particularly on reducing transaction costs, was in the year 2010 by a task force headed by the then Minister of State for Commerce and Industry, Jyotiraditya Scindia, who was a member of Parliament currently. Just to highlight the couple of things, which is the task force has been able to monetize transaction costs worth US 12 to 15 billion, roughly 7 to 10% of exports. That's the huge kind of overhang you can look at. And the report pointed out 70 particular interventions to be done by various ministries. I don't know what is the current situation of this today. Just to give you a bit of flavor of the task report, it says that while it takes 17 days to transport a container in India at a cost of US $945, the time taken in Brazil was 4 days, Denmark 5 days, and Mexico 14 days. Now, in terms of the conclusion of the report, it's a thick report, so let me just read a very important thing. The highlight has been detailed in the report: implementation of 23 issues, 21 already implemented and 2 to be implemented in near future, would mitigate transaction costs to an extent of rupees 2,100 crores approximately. I request Amit Kapoor to comment on the draft white paper and what do you think could be added or subtracted from the same to take it forward as an outcome document of this discussion. Amit, 5 minutes.
So Pradeep ji, thanks a lot for the opportunity. So just very quickly, just a couple of points which I feel need to be highlighted here, as clearly given in the white paper as well. That one, what is India's contribution to the world GDP that we are actually seeing at the present? In fact, that becomes a very important point to see, because that gives us a very clear understanding as to where we are stacked up against the world. And when we are saying that we are at about 2.5% or 3% of the world GDP, that leads us to a very important point as to why is it that we are getting stuck there. In fact, China and India diverged over a period of time in the 1990s. And then there is this, of course, issue of productivity that we are actually facing. In fact, one of the biggest challenges that India faces, or what I see is as a productivity crisis that we actually see, and productivity crisis across different sets of industries. In fact, what we are really saying as industries which are fairly competitive and stuff. In fact, when we talk about IT itself, there is a huge challenge in terms of even understanding IT industry within the country. In fact, from my point of view, Even IT industry in India is a factor-driven system wherein we are actually talking about labor arbitrage and exploitation of costs rather than actually making ourselves very productive. In fact, the productivity of a software engineer in India vis-a-vis, say, Israel is close. The difference is about 20 times, or India is 1/20th of whatever Israel actually does. So there are challenges on productivity level that we are actually facing. But now the question here is that what is it that we need to do? In fact, one of the critical factors is that if we really want to look at, say, inclusive growth per se, how do we go about doing it? What are the things that we need to do? Because the disparities that we see, of course, are challenging. But now, if you really want to talk about inclusive growth, we have to focus on two or three critical things. One is that how do we really go on to focus on low skilled manufacturing? If you really look at low skilled manufacturing, because if you really look at the number of unemployed people that we actually have, we will have to look at low skilled manufacturing as one of the defining movements. The second thing is that anything that we do from a competitiveness viewpoint will have to be towards employment generation. And when we talk about employment generation, the question is going to be what set of industries should we focus on? We will have to remove our obsession at the state level of doing everything under the sun. In fact, what we see is, in fact, if you really notice as to the structure of the economy at various states, what we end up seeing is that each state wants to do everything under the sun. But then I think we need to break that. Each state has a competency or an advantage in 3 or 4 distinct sets of industries, and that is what needs to be focused on. And if we are able to do that, then I think that is where the advantages would actually accrue, and that is where you will be able to improve your productivity. That is where you're talking about scale, what you call quality, and so on and so forth. So that needs to be very clearly looked at. The second thing that comes out across very, very strongly from the paper is what we are really talking about investing in certain set of social infrastructure. In fact, we just recently did some work on understanding the impact of investment in social infrastructure. Today, the problem that we face, the largest problem or the biggest problem in India is about education. So if you really talk about education, in fact, the numbers that we really see is that for every additional year of education, the incomes that would actually rise are close to about 8% on a yearly basis. So 1 year of education gives rise to about 8% of your income over a period of time. So if I'm able to educate people, that is where there is going to be a huge benefit that actually accrues. So the social infrastructure and social investment in education becomes exceedingly critical. And that too, in fact, it has to be something which has to happen across the board. It cannot be something which is done at the higher education or whatever. Today, we have much more challenging situation at the primary and the secondary education level. And if we take care of that, that is when the multipliers will actually start happening. So we need to focus on primary and secondary education and for a longer period of time. In fact, much more interestingly, if we invest in education for women, the returns are far greater than we can actually anticipate. And it also has huge benefits from a social point of view as we would really look at it. So, of course, the whole intangible thing that we are really seeing does move forward. One of the other things that we really talk about is the compliance burden. Today, the compliance burden is so huge for enterprises that we need to find a way to reduce the compliance burden. In fact, when you talk about as an enterprise, the cost of compliance today, like if you really talk about from a small retailer point of view, we were talking to some small retailers, and what we find is that 40% of the owner's time today is actually spent on filling up the forms and all the compliances that need to actually be taken care of. So that suddenly puts a lot of pressure on him as to what needs to be done. So we need to find a better way of compliance. The second thing is that we have to really find a way in terms of really moving ahead in terms of saying why do we really have to go after people who pay taxes or whatever? We have to increase the net, then don't consider people as thieves from that very point itself. We have to move forward from there. So we have to really start looking at enterprise and entrepreneurs in a much more positive light, and that compliance burden should actually be reduced. So having said that, there is also another thing in terms of like how do we create a level playing field within a certain set of sectors that we are actually looking at. Somehow there are situations like those anomalies are getting reduced now, but there are anomalies where the international players tend to actually have far better what I call possibilities of growing than the Indian firms. But like with the opening up of the geospatial thing, there are possibilities of enterprises like Mahatma India going forward and so on and so forth. So if we are really able to reduce those anomalies, it will actually go forward. But last but not the least, I think the most important point being availability of credit. All of us say that availability of credit is there, but the question is that how easy is it for a small enterprise to get access to that credit? Somehow the whole credit is actually given to the large enterprises and they default, and it creates what I call a panic in the system. But we have to find a way to really create much more reasonable ways of giving credit to smaller enterprises. China's example is very clear. It was the small enterprises which grew up and they became scaled enterprises. That is what we will have to do. And these are a few implementation steps that need to be taken forward to really make things move ahead.
Thank you.
Eventually, what we are really saying is productivity, improving productivity, and job creation. Over to you, Pradeep ji.
Thanks, Amit. Your points are well noted. May I request Preetam Banerjee? Preetam, do you want to add anything to what Amit has said?
Thank you, Pradeep. Just a couple of minutes. I think I will like to focus on the fact that we already spend as a country huge amounts of money, whether it's for education, for health, for the social interventions. We also have a large number of programs to develop industrial competitiveness, export competitiveness at the central, in many cases at the state level. The question is, what's the bang for the buck for that? Why are we not making significant and tangible progress? There, I think it goes back to the point of having accountability of these programs, of their enforcement design, and also in terms of the compliance burden, the whole issue of the quality of your administrative apparatus at the field level where the interactions happen between the entrepreneur and the government. Till we fix that on both these aspects, that the money we are investing in all of these things get well used, and the accountability and the compliance burden reduction. The last point that you mentioned, Pradeep, is about institutional memory. I happen to be, in fact, member of the task force on transaction cost in 2010 that you mentioned. And yes, at that stage, we addressed, as you mentioned, 21 of the, I think it was 46 or 47 total issues that we had looked at. And it exactly goes back to that point that once that was done, we have had 5 different committees that have looked at the same problem. I have been member of 3 of them myself. The continuity is not there. And anybody who has worked, with government in the recent past would know that there are these huge continuity jerks. That special, secretary changes, additional secretary changes, and there is complete, revamping, reinvention of the wheel that happens. Unless and until we start fixing these these sound like very small problems, but they add up to the systemic morass that we have. And unless and until we do that, we are investing a lot of money as a country, with huge budgets. This should give us returns, tangible ones, in relatively quick amount of time. We are not seeing it because our delivery mechanisms today are extremely inefficient. I'll end there. Thank you, Pradeep ji, for
Thank
giving.
you, Preetam. There's a request to you, and you've been a part of this process about 3 committees, and you rightly said what I have surmised is there's no continuity, there's no recall at all. Can you, when you were in subsequent committees, did you raise this issue?
I did, and in some cases, some of these issues were then included for further follow-up.
Right.
But it becomes a circular logic that you put it in, is discussed, it taken to a certain stage of conclusion, then the committee is wrapped up, it then goes on to the next round of discussions. So there are maybe 5-6 big issues around transaction costs for exports which never got resolved because the Ministry of Commerce is not doesn't have the jurisdiction, it's other ministries. And then what's made the first task force on transactions was so successful was that the minister at that time, Jyotirajit India, took a personal interest. In subsequent committees, that wasn't there. So we had rounds of discussions, the problems were always identified, the solutions were given, but never implemented. Because there was no political champion who would put his political capital to take it through. I think post the India government now with Prime Minister Modi's focus on doing business reforms, we have seen huge progress on that area. Again, precisely because the Prime Minister has put some of his own political capital into this process. So this is one of the other critical factors we need to have.
Let's have a talk about it separately. With that, thank you very much to both Amit and Preetam, who were the two catalysts for this particular series of webinars, including coming out with a white paper of actionable points and doable points. Now, today in the panel, we have various excellent commentators and speakers. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, Shamika Ravi, Ajit Pai from Niti Aayog, Manoj Panda, formerly from the Institute for Economic Growth, Ajay Shankar, who has, in this context particularly, has headed the, or has been Secretary of the National Manufacturing Competitiveness Council. We two regrets we had. Dr. Arvind Mairam, who took a vaccine shot yesterday and is suffering from fever. And Dheeraj Nayyar, I have no news as to what has happened to him, but we leave it at that. And may I now request Montek to please kick off. You heard both these excellent catalysts, and would you like to? How would you like to go about it? Over to you, Montek.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Pradeep, thank you very much for inviting me to join. I apologize because
Please go ahead, Montek.
See, I think what's happening, I mean, I go along with the broad thrust of what has been outlined in the paper. And inevitably, when we look at it, it all boils down to the fact that we've not grown fast enough. I mean, it's because any great growth, as if that was some kind of very limited objective. I mean, the truth is, we outline a policy which is consistent with achieving high rates of growth. And I think I agree with what has been said, that what is needed is a multifaceted intervention. You need more infrastructure, you need human capital, you need more investment, you need to encourage the private sector, you need a more supportive business environment, you need to be competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world, etc. I think what is happening though is that we're not translating what are these broad, uncontroversial objectives or slogans into actual detailed, actionable policies. Part of the problem, and this has been true of all our planning, that the whole planning approach always ends up saying everything is important. Everything is important, but it's more important to decide that for the next 2 or 3 years, what are the 4 or 5 areas where we really need to outline an actionable and agreed policy program? Now, I would say very respectfully that while education is absolutely crucial, I don't think it's an area that lends itself to an actionable program for the next 3 years. I mean, for the simple reason that it lies entirely in the hands of the state. So we have to act on that. But don't expect that that will show up in results in 3 years' time. On the other hand, if you're looking at ease of doing business or improving logistics, there you can lead to results in 3 years. I think it's also important to recognize that behind the sloganeering, there are areas where policies begin to differ. And I think it's important to identify some of those and for policy statements to be very clear on what our objective is. Now, over time, we have gained some clarity. I mean, for example, it is now very clear that development in India is going to be private sector led. Sometimes you get concerns about how do you regulate the private sector, how do you avoid cronyism, etc. But nobody, to my knowledge, is saying that because the private sector creates problems of cronyism, we're going to have a public sector-led development. That's very clear. It's also clear that the public sector has to have a big role. I mean, it's wrong to say that government in India is too large. By virtually any metric, government in India is smaller than it should be, but it's traditionally done the wrong things. So the question is, what is it that the government should do as opposed to what it is doing, which is micromanaging traditionally, which is micromanaging everything. Now that has been changing, and different governments over time have contributed to creating a relaxation that allows the private sector to be much, much more efficient. One other area where we now have clarity is FDI. I mean, even 10 years ago, the attitudes towards FDI, while positive, were qualified in certain areas. I think many of those areas of restriction have since been removed. And the government is repeatedly saying that, look, we want more FDI. So at that level, there's clarity. But at another level, let's say the actions that we take in the implementation of arbitration awards, that is multiplied by people to argue that we really don't mean what we say. So I think when we have FDI coming in, we have to be aware of the fact that these issues become controversial issues and we have to handle them. Let me talk about a little on competitiveness. I mean, I think it's very clear that you need to act on multiple fronts for competitiveness. You have to act on infrastructure. India's infrastructure is not up to scale, physical infrastructure. And I think we need to decide what is it operationally that we're really going to do to bring about the infrastructure that we need. Now, we have a lot of, if you like, ambitious targets on infrastructure investment, but they're not fitted yet into what is a reasonable medium-term budget constraint for the government. So it is not clear whether all the things they're talking about, I mean, we don't actually say that they're going to be done by the public sector. We say it's going to be a combination of center, state, and private sector. But it's not very clear that we have laid down what is it that's required for the private sector to actually take up some of this role. So that's, I think, an important issue. You know, a point was just made by the previous speaker that we keep having these committees. You know, I think the think tank community naturally gives a lot of importance to committees. And I mean, we in the Planning Commission used to give a lot of importance to plans, in the sense that this is said in the plan. But saying something in the plan doesn't make it a policy. It's only a recommendation. Similarly, what the Niti Aayog outlined doesn't become a policy. So we must come to a very clear understanding of what is an actual approved policy. Committee reports are not policies. I remember when I was in the Planning Commission, we had appointed Kirit Parekh to produce a report on a sustainable energy policy for India. And people in the Planning Commission kept referring to that as the policy. And I said, no, it's not a policy. It's actually just a committee report. And the Planning Commission should go to the cabinet to get approval for 30 different things that were implied in that policy. Now, as an exception, because normally in those days, it was the ministry responsible that would take things to cabinet, but they made an exception and allowed us to take it. You know, although it was approved by the cabinet, the approval was that this is approved for the relevant ministry to take forward. So I think this is a big problem in our system. We need to government needs to announce very clearly what is actually an announced policy. Now, the nice thing about the budget is that is a policy. I mean, if the finance minister says she's reducing corporate tax rates, she's going to reduce corporate tax rates, and you can assume that that's done. That's not true for most other things, because the detail is actually left out. And it only becomes clear when it's actually spelled out by the operational ministry. Now, quite frankly, one other issue of controversy I want to mention. You know, there is a huge growing gap in the perception of how important is openness in trade policy to achieving the rapid growth of industry and increased competitiveness. there is a feeling growing that actually the way to move forward is to build in a certain amount of protection in the hope that that will give you time to gain competitiveness. And I don't happen to share that view, but the truth of the matter is that in the last 4 years, we have raised tariffs on almost 4,000 items. I think we need to be clear. I mean, some increases in tariffs are always possible. Our government representatives always say that this is within our rights with the WTO. This is absolutely correct because we have bound tariffs at a very high level. So we could actually double most of our tariffs and we would still be within our entitlement. But that doesn't mean that's good for us. So I think we need a debate. What is going to be our tariff policy and over what period is it going to be carried out? Can we still expect continuing tariff increases? The first vice chairman of Niti Aayog, Arvind Panagriya, is a very distinguished trade economist. When he produced the first Niti Aayog 3-year agenda, he had said that we should continue the process of reducing duties. It's actually too slow. And we should narrow the spread, which means higher duties should be brought down, lower duties should be raised, and it should be averaged around 7% or so. I mean, the most recent assessment of our average is about 13.5. So in the next 5 years, what exactly do we plan to do? We need to have a government endorsement of what policy is so that we can then monitor whether it's happening or not. Now, I think this is an area on which there isn't agreement, and I think this committee, your group, Pradeep, could reflect on it. What is our view? Was the first Niti Aayog report on the 3-year agenda for India correct or not? Remember, on the growth side, we're all talking about high growth targets. Will we get back to 7, 8%? All this talk about employment. I don't believe that you're going to get an increase in employment if you don't get a pickup in growth. We will get good growth this year, but that will only take us back to the 2019-2020 level. The real question is at the end of the coming fiscal year, in other words, from 22-23 onwards, at what rate will the economy grow? Now, it's very uncertain. China has actually given up having medium-term targets, so you could even say we don't know. But one thing we can be sure about, given what's happening on the employment front and given the need to employ people, I don't believe that we can do that if we don't aim at something of the order of 7 to 8% growth. And I think there's a lot of talk about promoting labor-intensive manufacturing. Certainly, we should be promoting them. Some of the demand for this will be internal. Then there's the issue that, are we going to be in a position to compete for the global demand, which will actually come back? Even if it doesn't come back growing at the rapid rate that it used to, it will come back. And if that is so, we need to plan for it. So I think these are the issues that we have to consider. And that links up with trade policy. I mean, can we expect to become a successful exporter if we remain a country with the highest tariff rates in the world? And we happen to have the advantage of being in Asia, which is a fast-growing area, and an increasingly trade-integrated area. Is it a good idea for us to stay out of Rsip? Now, this is an issue which is still open, on which the government has to decide. I think industry should take a view. And frankly, apart from economics, there are geopolitical reasons why we should actually join Rsip. So these things go beyond a very wide range of subjects, which can be discussed at a general level. But my only thing would be, let's narrow this down to very specific policies so that one can tick them off and say, was this done, wasn't this done? And also, let me add, I don't think we can have 100% success. I mean, if we make a list of the important things to do in the next 3 or 4 years, and we end up saying that, look, we've managed to do 75% of them, I think that's pretty good. You would never be able to get 100%. But it should be based on a clear identification of what are the specific things that need to be done. Now, with those words, thank you for inviting me, and I apologize that I have to leave because of a conflicting engagement. Thank you.
Thanks, Montek. While introducing the panel, I forgot to mention Rajat Kathuria is also with us. Rajat is the Director and Chief Executive Officer of Acrea. And my apologies for that. Having said that, let me thank Montek for his excellent opening remarks, including reminding us of all the macros and how do we deal with those macros in order to relate them to the micros. That is what we are trying to achieve in this particular webinar. Of course, micros cannot be discussed or cannot be arrived at unless you address the macros which are there as the drivers. With that, let me now request Ajay Shankar, 5 to 7 minutes.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Okay. So about 7 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I will try and move from the macro to the micro level. So one point which doesn't get enough attention when we talk about competitiveness or policy or reform is the real exchange rate. Now, if you look at the success of all the East Asian economies, they pursued a conscious policy of keeping the exchange rate artificially low, artificially depreciated, to create the incentives for domestic value addition and for exports. So if you look at our experience, I think somewhere between 2007-8 to 17, the real exchange rate appreciated by 10%. Now, that is an equivalent of roughly 10% lowering of import duties. So I think we need to bring this issue center stage and somehow persuade government as well as the RBI that, okay, let us not try and artificially depreciate the currency because the international system would not agree and would have a sharp eye. But we must at least see that there is no real exchange rate appreciation, which is completely divorced in India's case from any increase in real productivity. Now, we are sui generis because we get NRI remittances, we get, FII inflows because our stock market is very attractive. So the real exchange rate appreciation has nothing to do with the fundamentals of the economy. And if you say had not got this 10% real exchange rate appreciation, then a lot of that demand for raising import duties would not have been there. So going forward, the first thing would be a national consensus that we will maintain the real exchange rate. And this has to be signaled clearly by the RBI because investors take decisions not on what happens to the exchange rate tomorrow, but what is the policy trajectory or what is the trajectory they see down the road. Because if I invest today and there is a 5-7% real exchange rate appreciation in the next 5 years, my business case goes in one direction. So this is something which somehow never features in discussions. Politically, there is this completely erroneous view that a strong rupee means a strong economy. So this is one thing on which I think a lot more discussion and advocacy is needed. The second major point is that I think we've been focusing a lot on and have made significant progress on trying to reduce the regulatory compliance burden, at least it comes center stage, thanks to Pradeep's recent efforts, and the ministry is trying to do something in that direction. But the real thing from a business point of view is not just the cost of compliance and the regulatory burden, but the cost of doing business. Now, reducing the cost of doing business is not yet a subject of sufficient discussion or micro-level analysis. So I'll just give you one example. Petrol and diesel are the key cost element in transport. So ideally, they should be in GST and at the lowest rate because that's what will reduce the cost of doing business. But the discussion on bringing it into GST is yet to begin. Now, on the other hand, we want to have a PLI scheme and give all kinds of subsidies, which will not undo the enormous cost that every enterprise has to bear, with petrol and diesel prices being taxed at over 50-55%. Same as the argument has been made earlier in terms of electricity. So we have to look at it from a business person's point of view and from the point of view of an investor now who's mobile globally, within India and overseas. So lowering the cost of doing business and what it entails, obviously not easy. If you bring petrol or diesel into GST, then you lose so much revenue, do you have that much of a higher deficit? Or where else can you raise revenues? Or where can you cut expenditure? Now, there's not enough discussion at a granular level on these issues in the budget. The next point is that Monty is absolutely right, that till you have growth, you won't create jobs. But I would like to suggest that the focus should be on creating jobs, modern jobs, or not jobs in traditional handicrafts, and pursue that as a goal and look at GDP growth as a consequence. So if the trade-off is, say, between 9% GDP growth and 8% with more jobs, I would any day choose 8%. Now, all our states have these huge investor meets, lakhs and lakhs of crores of investment, but no indication of the number of jobs that would be created. And if we want to create jobs and we want to look at industrial competitiveness, then I think it's time we moved into looking at it at a micro level, which is an industry vertical or a cluster, and look at what is it that will give us the bang for the buck in the next 2-3 years in achieving competitiveness. So for instance, take the textile sector. It's one of the most labor intensive in the country. It creates huge employment. But we have not made a serious effort to have a structural shift that we do not export cotton, raw material, we do not export fiber or fabric, but we try and shift to a position where we export only garments. Now, the global garment industry moves to low-wage economies. It's gone to Vietnam, to Bangladesh. We are not getting it. So we should have a serious discussion as to why we are not getting it. What is it that we need to do to get it? I mean, maybe we should go to the low-wage areas of Bihar or Bengal or Orissa and build flatted factories with garmenting machines and say to investors from anywhere in the world, including China, that come here, try it out free for 6 months to a year. If you succeed, you buy it, rent it, etc., etc. So we have to think out of the box if we want to go beyond exhortation of labor-intensive growth. Or take another area of labor-intensive activity. Globally, shipbuilding has moved to low-wage locations. Now, we don't have any game plan of bringing shipbuilding to India. Now, this will need strategic state-led intervention. One other important point is that we talk of skill development in the abstract. But the place to begin with is the existing workforce in the existing MSMEs and industrial clusters and industrial verticals, and pick up those where we are not globally competitive. So the auto industry and its supply chain is globally competitive. Let's leave that alone. But everywhere else, I think a little state-led effort, state-led money on measuring productivity and quality today, putting in even public money, I mean, that would be public money well spent, in actually increasing the quality and productivity of the workforce. Now, many of the programs of the MSc, ME, a lot of money is spent in those programs, look at interventions which try to improve the managerial ability of the owners, entrepreneurs. But till the productivity and quality of the workforce improves, they will not become globally competitive. And one of the factors which prevents India from succeeding in labor-intensive jobs or getting FDI into labor-intensive jobs is the perception, and a bit of it is right, that the Indian labor force or workforce is neither productive, nor disciplined, nor does it easily amenable to having quality consciousness of the kind which would make you globally competitive. Now it's time we recognize that problem and try to address it in little islands and little industrial workers, because a macro level transformation of a cultural level in India is a big task. But certainly in some industry verticals, we can do it. If we demonstrate success, I think sends a huge signal. Because the fact of the matter is that where we are globally competitive in auto or pharmaceuticals, the workforce is as good in terms of quality and productivity as anywhere else in the world. Otherwise, the industry wouldn't be surviving and prospering. But the overall perception is that labor in India better stay away. So even Indian entrepreneurs prefer capital-intensive investment to labor-intensive investment, except in call centers. So I think this is something which needs to be recognized and addressed frontally. Now, Montek made a very valid point of these, incremental, piecemeal increases in import duties. I think that's not a good idea. I think the correct approach is that, okay, this is one sector where we are not globally competitive. In 5 years or 7 years, we will make a breakthrough. We will do all what we think will work, undoing the inverted duty structure or creating, import duty protection of the finished good or subsidized inputs or whatever. But there should be a clear game plan which is there for the next 5-7 years with a roadmap and a trajectory of state interventions clearly laid out. So that gives predictability and confidence to the investor that yes, here is a real business proposition. The government, India, state government mean what they are saying. And let's look at the business case. Because the fact is that those who invest money take the risks and they don't react to piecemeal announcements. They look at the underlying reality. So I think a sector-specific approach for creating industrial competitiveness is the right way to forward and putting together the building blocks of that. Rather than, and one last point, the logistics costs and the infrastructural costs are high. And the way to overcome them would be in the short run, again taking Montek's point, is provide a liberal sum of central money to provide the connectivity through expressways, etc., to ports and national highways from existing industrial clusters. Now, to me, it's a failure that even today there is not a railway line extension and a freight terminal to any of the automobile manufacturing plants in the country. Now, it's easily doable, it doesn't cost too much. But somehow there is not enough loose central money and a focus on improving logistics for existing industrial clusters. So that's the way to go forward. In 2-3 years, we can make a huge impact. Thank you.
Thank you. Ajay, before you go, there is a very interesting question from the audience, which is addressed to all the speakers, including, let me start with you, is how important are the agriculture reforms to broader competitiveness?
Agriculture is in a state of crisis, and it's quite apparent. So we need two things. One is we need to accelerate urbanization and industrialization and job creation so that 65% of the population, depending on 15% of the GDP, comes down within a few years to say 50% or 45% or 30%, which means massive increase in urbanization. The second is a focus on improving productivity and efficiency. A lot of it is happening due to market forces and good things are happening. But I think the state needs to see where it can make an intelligent, smart intervention which doesn't lock it into long-term subsidies, which is what has happened with the breakthrough in the Green Revolution. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. May I now invite Shamika?
Thank you, Pradeep. Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. The discussion we are having right now it's so comprehensive in terms of its agenda itself that, and I agree with everything the previous speakers have said. I want to contribute by basically highlighting a few points and bringing some data points to sort of drive home those points. I think the point about clarity of objective, it cannot be underscored enough. First of all, the fact that is growth important? I mean, 5 years back, we were having these discussions that, there's been too much overheating, it's unsustainable growth. Just look at the way money has gone into all kinds of, projects with very large NPAs, therefore pulling the banking sector with it and so on and so forth. So perhaps the focus should be much more on improving the quality of regulation and improving institutions, the banks, etc. So growth really did, while it remained fundamental, it did sort of, take a bit of a backseat with growing focus on governance and sort of delivery of subsidies. And so it was more about raising efficiency within the government systems and that of the regulators. But I'm glad that now the clarity is there in terms of putting growth at the center of it. And of course, some of it might have been accelerated by the fact that the pandemic truly has created a big dent. So much so the first quarter we did suffer a minus almost 24% decline. But what is also now very clear, at least as far as this current, the budget statement put out as a policy statement put out last month, is that it's fairly clear now the growth is at the heart of it, and the growth strategy will be one of infrastructure spending financed by borrowing in the short run, but divestment or privatization in the medium to longer term. And I think that clarity in vision is very important. And I think that is the reason why it was welcomed even by people who, or by quarters who are traditionally who've been skeptical of this government. So I think that clarity is emerging and growth is now at the center of it. And we know it is going to be private sector led growth. But against that, we also know that for that growth to happen, competitiveness or improving the capacity of institutions like Competition Commission become fundamental for good quality growth, so that we're not, again, 5 years we have a spurt because it's like UPA2 we had very high growth, but almost everyone who was watching it closely knew that this will be short-lived. You're not going to be able to get 2-digit growth because fundamentally this overheating is absolutely unsustainable. So I think you don't want these kind of big shocks, positive shock, but it really messes up the quality of institutions in a way that it's not going to be long-term sustainable. So I think that discussion on competition and improving regulatory framework, and therefore institutions such as Competition Commission should be at the heart and simultaneously happening while government is also making its policy statement very clear in terms of privatization and spending on infrastructure, etc. But there are certain structural features to our economy which are so peculiar, and frankly, that is not observed elsewhere, that we can't just copy paste and think it is going to work here. Some of those structural features, for instance, one is the fact that we have an incredibly low labor force participation overall. Bangladesh has about 57-58% labor force participation. Vietnam has had above 74% now for several years. China had for almost 30 years about 74-75% labor force participation. India, even at the peak, has had 50% labor force participation. And I'm not just talking about women, I'm talking about overall labor force participation in the economy. So this is just a bizarre enigma. What is the rest of the working age population doing if they are neither working nor looking for work? So I'm not talking unemployment, I'm just talking about labor force participation itself. Are there measurement issues or is this fundamentally true? If it is, then I think we should try and understand, because it's a structural weakness. Second is, I think, of course, the declining labor force participation of women is truly a big problem because it means we are, there's a very large amount of human capital which is unproductive. Of course, it is not monetized. If we begin monetizing what women are doing in the houses, perhaps there'll be a correction. But nonetheless, markets need to find value for human capital in the right sort of way, and that is another big structural feature which needs addressal. Now, the way macroeconomists typically look at it, as you saw Montague's response, that look, education is not going to get you this in the next 3 years, but you know what, we should be thinking next 50 years. Some of these structural features have been so long-term sustained bottlenecks that you can't possibly only be thinking about short-term corrections or trying to reach this high growth without taking care of these long-term structural features, because again, we know it will be short-lived and possibly distortionary, right? Because this has deeper implications for the society as a whole. Then think of the bank, the private market, the corporate sector. If you consider how much of the banking capital is truly going to the private sector in India, it's close to 40%. Now that number for China is 140%, which means a lot of the bank capital is really cornered by the public sector itself. And that again tells you that, look, I think this constant reiteration by the Prime Minister now is a much needed one. That wealth creators, private entrepreneurs, our corporations, I mean, these are not evil. They are truly bringing a lot of value to the table, and they are sort of helping grow economy and overall well-being. So I think that, again, that credit support must also improve. So I think improving some of this major bottlenecks, they need to be eased. We need to extend more capital. Now, think of when we are, of course, in the middle of a pandemic. It is not over yet. Vaccinations have increased. But treating education and health as social subject, I think that is the biggest disservice we do when we undermine human capital itself. I mean, we've hardly taken ministries, education still because of the inherent political nature of it. But health has always been a side issue. We have seldom spoken about health reforms, despite knowing that not only is it holding productivity of Indians low, but also we are missing out the opportunity cost of not viewing healthcare as an engine of growth. I personally believe healthcare can do for India what IT has done in the last 30 years, healthcare can do for the next 50 years. There's an aging world population. Everyone is looking to reduce health costs. No economy has really been able to reduce health cost, which means all of this is going to drive home a lot of business. And I'm not just talking about pharmaceuticals, vaccines, I'm talking health IT, I'm talking about health HR, nurses, doctors. This is an entire area of future growth, which we are not preparing ourselves with because we club health as a social sector, and therefore we relegate it along with many other social things, and it's not fundamental to the economy, and I think that is a big problem. Now, the other issue is in terms of skill. We've been talking about skills a great deal, but India again has a peculiar feature. We are the only country other than China which has graduate unemployment, which means that in the age group of 18 to 29, which is youth, people who have a graduate degree and above are almost 6 times as likely to report being unemployed compared to people who have primary education and below. What does that tell you? It tells you that, first of all, and by the way, simultaneously, industry is telling you one of the biggest bottleneck is skilled manpower. Now, the two simultaneously are telling you what the crisis in the education sector is. That we are producing these degreed graduates by millions, except they're not employable. Now, of course, quality of education is a problem, which means there is a big tension between degree and actual skill that the market values. But I think, that fundamentally also is telling you that the cost of improving productivity is also now squarely sitting on the private sector. The IT sector employs, on campus recruitment, thousands of students and basically has to retrain them over months, almost close to a year, before they truly become productive. Now, the cost, therefore, of not having quality education is now being borne by the larger economy, by the private sector. Again, it unnecessarily raises, and therefore quality of education and reforms which improve quality of education has to be very importantly addressed. Again, a priority. The other issue is we talk of high unemployment, but what we miss out on are the variations across the states. It's very clear if you look at unemployment level across states of India, that it's the states that are growing are also the places where unemployment is lowest. States that are doing well in Niti Aayog ranking, or whatever you might think of the ranking, but objectively year after year, when you see that some states are bringing in reforms and in terms of improving their ease of doing business, defined as per the parameters, those states are again areas where unemployment levels are low. So I compare Gujarat and Karnataka, which have reported unemployment, of course, this is 2018-19 data, of 0.9 and 1.5%, to Kerala, Tripura, which have like 12%, 14%. Now, these are some inherent tensions where we need to recognize that job creation, yes, the government can create jobs and there are lots of government vacancies, etc. But eventually it is wealth creation in the economy which is also going to lead to job creation. So jobs are very strongly linked with ease of doing business and sort of promoting it. And I think finally, my last point is really on this growing protectionism and the fear. And of course, simultaneously, the government talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat. And I think, if you take a historical view of things, and now I'm going to just sort of throw open some questions. First of all, export-led economies, particularly China as an example, we completely undermine the fact that China's export simultaneously was happening while there was a lot of market manipulation, currency manipulation happening. And so was it simply, is it simply export or are there other things that need to go with it? That's number one. Number two, historically, right? Whether it was the US, whether it was Germany, and of course, latest China, all these economies have truly practiced very stringent protectionism before becoming competitive in specific areas and then becoming champions of free market. So now, of course, one can say that India's first 40 years, protectionism didn't really yield very high growth. But the evidence in the development literature is quite scanty. The connection between protectionism or openness of economy and growth, that still is a bit of a tenuous. But one thing I can, the last thought I want to leave you with is if we think, or if we believe our growth strategy will be private investment and private growth, private industry, which is going to be the engine of our future growth, supported by enabling sort of spending and administrative capacity, regulatory capacity of the government, then we have to turn the focus completely on improving competitiveness within the country. I think we cannot have a long-term sustainable growth without making our own industries competitive. And the forces, the best quality control is truly the power of competition. And I think Competition Commission, we don't hear enough of. We don't hear enough from the Competition Commission. So I think we need a lot of focus now on some of these institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamika. In fact, in 2011, we even drafted a national competition policy, which would then be used as a basic driver for competitiveness and competition across all sectors. And that has been lying on the website of the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, unfortunately. I had a meeting with Nirmala Sitaraman the other day and also mentioned this to her. I hope something can happen. And the point what you're saying is music to my ears. Now, Shamika, the one question which is asked by Shantanu Mitra, how important are agricultural reforms to broader competitiveness? Can you give a short answer to that?
Well, again, if you take a 100-year vision, Pradeep, and this is where I really don't think we should be looking at next 4 years, 5, 10. If you look at the next 100 years, do you think agriculture should be that sector where 50% of our population should be employed? If not, you really have to open up to what has been the traditional development growth feature of every other economy. Because the nature of productivity gains, the nature of value addition, that comes from manufacturing and services more so, it is very difficult for agriculture to match that. So over time, raising productivity in agriculture will also mean that we give these opportunities to our, very large people who are still in the agriculture sector. They have the opportunity to leave it. So agriculture reforms, I think, are very, very fundamental if we take a longer term view of this. And this is where I also encourage you to read this one article I wrote on Punjab in particular, that what happens when we believe agriculture will be the only sector which will drive the economy of even a state. Rapid deindustrialization. There's a lot of cross-subsidization within the state. Increasingly, industry has to bear the price of what is highly subsidized agriculture, which leads to long-term distortions. So I think agriculture cannot be the engine of growth of an economy, even highly technologically advanced economies like Switzerland, Israel, etc., which have a very high productive agriculture sector. The engines are not agriculture. And it's important to recognize that people need opportunities outside, and we should be forming policies which open those opportunities outside agriculture.
But doesn't agriculture create jobs?
Not enough. Not enough. In fact, higher productivity will mean we will end up mechanizing more.
Thank you. May I now invite Rajat Kathuria? Rajat?
Hi, Pradeep.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Pradeep. Thanks.
Welcome.
Thank you. I think this is a wonderful discussion, and I don't sort of violently disagree with anything that has been said. Let me sort of pick up from where Amit and Montek and Ajay Ji and Shamika has also spoken about, but let me pick up a comment that Amit had made, which is that we should not be doing everything. Every state should not be doing everything, and states should possibly rely on their comparative advantage or competitive edge and produce things that are competitive in that particular state. We shouldn't be doing everything on our own. Of course, this sort of takes one back to self-reliance in a different way in the 60s and 70s and Atmanirbhar Bharat today, which is what I want to stress, and it has already been mentioned, but I want to sort of further reinforce this point that we cannot do everything all by ourselves and still remain competitive. I think that's fundamentally what Amit was trying to say. And one of the things that, Paul Samuelson had said when he was asked, what is this subject called economics and what does it really do for the real world? And what is it that is both non-trivial and true of economics? And the one-line answer that Paul Samuelson gave was comparative advantage. I mean, that's something which is non-trivial and yet true at the same time. And I think that's something we have to drive home in all its manifestation, not only for the states, but also for the country as a whole. And I think Montek had made this point fairly forcefully, and so did Ajay. Let me sort of manifest this in the arguments that I want to make about India's integration with the global economy. On the one hand, and be competitive, right? So we are talking about competitiveness. How is it that we are going to become competitive? If you just take the baseline as the 70s and 80s, when we had, as Montek said, 400% tariffs, and people were taking decisions in the Planning Commission on behalf of the rest of the population and saying that, no, we shouldn't open up our economy because we waste our resources on lipstick and powder, and therefore we should only get computer chips and not potato chips, etc. Those sort of arguments, we should get what we need, and sort of second guessing the market, not allowing the market to play out. Of course, the market fails, and we need to address market failure, but to sort of second guess the market in resource allocation is something that Russia and former Soviet Union did, and they recognized the fault and the weakness of being able to do that. So I feel that, it's going to be private sector. There's no doubt about that. And private sector is going to be the driver of growth. The private sector is going to be driver of competitiveness, and market failures have to be addressed by the state. I think in the context of openness, I want to just lay out 3 points which we could consider. One is the fact that if we have to become competitive, can we become competitive on the basis of our domestic economy alone, or do we need to integrate with the global economy? And historical evidence suggests that if we are going to become a competitive economy at the micro level, we need the global economy to be able to export and therefore become competitive. No country before us has become a competitive economy without being an export economy. I mean, there are instruments to do that, as Shamika was pointing out, but the outcome is we have to become competitive if we want to we have to become export oriented if we have to remain a competitive economy. There's also a macro link to it in terms of the tyranny of the macroeconomic numbers. If you're running a current account deficit and you're getting more investment, then you can't be selling only to your domestic market because consumption levels are going to come down if you're going to have higher investment and higher saving. But I won't go there for the moment. So that's my first point. We need to become export-led or export-oriented, if not export-led. The second point I want to leave on the table is the fact that we want to participate in global value chains. We want to be a member of regional value chains and global value chains. And yet at the same time, we are saying that we need to increase our value added. And the way to increase our value added is to one is to increase the level of tariffs and greater protection, and then try and increase the value added at home and therefore become competitive. I think that's not a good route to become competitive. many years ago, the World Bank had done a report which said that if you balance a sort of 10% increase in tariffs versus a 10% improvement in logistics and transportation infrastructure, then the bigger bang for the buck, as Pritam will tell you, always lies in improving the quality of your logistics and quality of your infrastructure. Although that takes a longer time to do naturally, and import tariffs you could implement very, very quickly. But that does mean that your participation in global value chains and regional value chains will sort of sit uneasy with your trying to become competitive in the global market, because there'll be a lot of people who would then divert their investments to other countries, because foreign direct investment is linked to trying to improve your export. And the immediate model before us is the Chinese model. They started with small value addition, and we have the famous example of the Apple and iPhone, etc., where the Chinese value added was minimal in the beginning, and over time they were able to increase their value added by learning, by doing. And it doesn't really happen that you can move up the value chain immediately. It's a long and arduous process, and it will take time. But I think raising tariffs to try and increase the value added, at the same time wanting to participate in global value chains, at the same time talking about increased protectionism, these things, I think, lie uneasy with the ultimate objective, and there are going to be trade-offs there. So that's the second point I wish to make, that increasing protectionism doesn't sit well with trying to participate and increase your value-added components. And we found that in the 70s and 80s, how difficult it became to increase value-added at home, how difficult, how hard it was for us to improve competitiveness, because nobody then wanted to buy our products, and we were able to sell, highly inflated costs at highly inflated prices to a protected market, really poor quality products. And you don't want to repeat that episode at all. We've come out of that, and it's been a hard sort of earned reform that we've been able to do. And really, you don't want to go back to that regime. And once you put protectionism in place, it becomes, because of the political economy, it becomes very difficult to dismantle that. And anyway, import tariffs today contribute very little to the exchequer. So I think a better way out is try to focus on improving competitiveness through other routes rather than through increasing protectionism, because that will not serve the objective of improving competitiveness. And the last point I wish to make is, again, the point that Montek has made, again, in terms of the open economy, in terms of the integration with the global economy. I think we need to get our narrative right about trade. Does trade create jobs? Does trade create poverty alleviation effects? Does trade create growth? Versus does trade create inequality, and does trade increase the incomes of the already haves versus the have-nots? And I think Ajay ji made an important point about you need to sort of focus on growth. You need to focus on jobs rather than focusing on other very, very high growth rates, because that will drive inequality. The same thing, we need to talk about trade. Does trade, the narrative that has been created in the West during Brexit and during Trump's regime and during the election campaign, was that trade actually is responsible for higher inequality. And I think one of your panelists did mention that if you look at the contribution to trade to inequality, or look at the contribution of education to inequality, I think education is much more responsible, skill levels are much more responsible for inequality than you can't hold trade and globalization responsible for the levels of inequality that countries face or countries experience. So I think the narrative around trade, that trade is causing this inequality, needs to be, if it does, so be it, but at least have a serious academic debate on whether in India trade creates that inequality, or whether there are other things that Ajay ji was talking about, the labor, the labor laws, the inspectors, and the other sort of intentions to become capital intensive, to move away from labor and all the problems that labor has. Is it that, or is it trade that is causing the inequalities that we are seeing in India? If trade actually benefits blue collar jobs, as Amit was beginning to point out, labor intensive manufacturing, if trade actually benefits those, then we should call that as it is. Because I think the narrative that current account deficits are bad and that we should run current account surpluses, which each country that we have a bilateral trade agreement with, I think it doesn't do well it doesn't serve our policy establishment well. It provides a political hook then to become increasingly protectionist. Maybe we haven't negotiated our trade agreements properly. Maybe we haven't negotiated our trade and investment and services agreements. Maybe we should renegotiate those. But to say that current account deficits with each country are a manifestation of unequal terms seems to suggest that we don't want to recognize the fact that we are not competitive enough to be able to export. And there's no problem in India running current account deficits, I think, in the state of development that we are in. And therefore, I think I would encourage us to run current account deficits, provided they are sustainable and they are because of investments, they are because of technology, because then that can enable us to invest. You know, Foxconn can come in, Wistron can come in, Pegatron can come in on the back of the PLIs, produce in India, create labor-intensive jobs in India, and then make our industry more competitive. And if electronics becomes competitive, as Hosman will tell you in the product service map, then it enables you to become competitive in other sectors as well. So I leave it at that. I just want to emphasize, you know, I've spoken on competitiveness largely, and I think increasing protectionism, focusing on bilateral current account deficits, and wanting to grow on the back of the domestic market. These are three sort of important issues that need to be discussed, and we need to get our narrative around trade and competitiveness.
Thank you, Rajat.
Thank you.
One of the best narratives run in the Indian media on pro-trade narrative is by Arvind Pangadia. Though tragically, we've lost another very good pro-trade narrator, Jayanto Roy, just the other day. So we do have, and we also continuously raise this particular issue. My own reading of the Atmanirbhar statement made by the Prime Minister was, and please correct me if you don't agree with me, when he said Atmanirbhar Bharat and jointly with global supply chains, it meant trade openness. And I think what he meant more by Atmanirbharta was sort of Atma-Samman or self-confidence, which is what has been preventing India to join bilateral trade agreements. The industry lacks self-confidence for whatever reason, and that has always come in the way. And we have discussed that on various fora, including on Kutch fora, when we did an event on Rsip. What comes out again and again is industry is very shy. I mean, they still feel that they are infants, but be that as it may. May I now request Ajit Pai. Ajit is with the Niti Aayog.
Thank you, Pradeep. It was fascinating listening to all the other perspectives so far. So let me not spend too much time on what's already been covered and sort of reduce the overlap with what's already been discussed. But just looking at the draft version 2 of the India, your white paper, the February 2021, I was just thinking of what what my wish list for this document would be to make the discourse in the overall discussion closer to what I think some of the issues are that go across both the private and the public sector. So, I go completely with all the regulatory compliance, interest, all those other factors are there. I think they've been discussed and, we've got some good perspectives there. So now what are these other factors? So I think the first two that I would touch is one, we have to, we've got to actually discuss and see what competitiveness really means, define it in the way that we would like to address it in this white paper. And the second is also for what inclusive economic growth, how do we actually envisage that? The fastest way to cross over from one side of a football field for 11 players to the other side is not likely to be with everyone holding hands together and just going across. It's probably everyone without holding hands going across and running across that field together. So the manner in which we understand and we define it, I think there is a slide in that presentation that discusses both of these, but I want to dive a little deeper into these. So the overarching themes that go across both private and public sector, the first that I want to sort of see, sort of fleshed out a little bit more in this white paper would be the factor of scale. So scale is something I think in India that is, misunderstood in many different ways. I think most regulations, the way the regulatory authorities, the way the supervisors, the way even the government itself thinks about it is to protect the small to the cost of the large. So if you look at your labor laws, you look at the compliance burden as you get bigger, the manner in which it increases, all of that, I think, is sort of created an environment where relative scale across industries, whether it's primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector, all of that has actually provided significant competitive disadvantage to India, across the board. Whether you look at agriculture, the question I think that, someone asked, the average scale or size of an Indian landholding is 2 acres. It's less than a hectare. And over the past 50 years or 70 years, it's been headed in the wrong direction. You actually wanted that to be going up, as it has in most of the Western world. The best quality producers, or let's not call it the best quality producers, but the best in class producers in terms of productivity for agricultural product, less than 1% of the country can feed the entire country and have excess left for exports. India at 43% as per the last census, maybe it's dropped to 37 or 38 or 39 today. We're more than an order of magnitude away from where we really need to be. But when we step outside of agriculture and we look at almost any sector, whether you're looking at retail, whether you're looking at manufacturing, whether you're looking at steel, whether you're looking, manufacturing heavy, manufacturing light, the textile industry, what you're going to find is that the relative scale of an Indian manufacturer is too small. And the overall system is geared towards protecting it, whether, it's, the MSME with great difficulty, we change these sort of metrics or what an MSME, each of those metrics should look like for a company, barely keeping up with inflation each time they've gone up. But do we really, want to be systematically taking from someone that can sort of create capital, where capital formation can happen, take that away from them and try and support someone that is below what I would call competitive scale, that is below critical mass? If that is what inclusive is, then we've got to rethink what that inclusiveness means. So that's one very important factor that we've got to look at. Countries that have come up that curve over the past 50 years of becoming truly competitive from not being competitive. Some of these countries, if you look at Korea, for example, the manner in which they've done it is by providing scale. People say that you've talked about competition. Several speakers have talked about competition, and why we've got to look at this competition also matters, because if the Competition Commission of India looks at competition within India, I think that doesn't do justice. If you look at the Korean model, you can say that it was completely non-competitive internally in terms of, or not, I shouldn't say non-competitive, it was anti-competition almost. When you had high concentrations in certain industries, but the way they defined their own marketplace was in global terms. So this competitiveness that we're talking about, whether it is Amit ji that talked about it or other speakers that talked about it, we've got to look at this competitiveness at a global level, not necessarily at a local level. One of the mistakes we make is that if in industries where we are not at global scale, like, it's been mentioned that we're less than 3% of overall global GDP. And within our country, if you're going to keep our industries highly fragmented because of, maintaining domestic competition, then we might not be giving our industries the opportunities to actually attain global scale and be competitive at a global level. So we've got to define this competitiveness. We've also got to define that agenda and mandate and the discourse at the Competition Commission, so that things are looked at far more at a global level rather than at a domestic level. So, competition is something that, is a matter that's fairly close to us. While we want to ensure that India is competitive, we also have to make sure that we define that correctly. Now, two other factors that I think that have been touched upon very briefly by other speakers, but haven't been given, I think, sufficient attention to in improving India's competitiveness for inclusive economic growth, the white paper. The first is focus, and the second is sequence. So by focus, I mean that if you have a look at the manner in which India has operated, both its its governance as well as its regulations, all of that in the past, it tends to try and do too many things. If you have a look at the budget document traditionally, or not this particular one, but across the board, it's addressing many points across many things, trying to be as inclusive, trying to take care of every group in its own way. And that reflects a lack of strategy. And a strategy is not just the destination where you want to get to, that's more of a target. Strategy is also a sequence on how you get to where you want to. And that sequence, is something that I think we need to spend much more time on, which I think a lot of other speakers have alluded to, but it's not specifically flushed out in that white paper, which is where do we go first, where do we go next, and where do we go subsequently? Is it just, creating greater education? I think Dr. Ravi pointed out that just educating people in a certain state doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have employment, whereas other states might have very low unemployment. So do we really want to, the manner in which we sequence our investments within the country and across the country, is it infrastructure first? Is it education first? Is it agricultural productivity first? A lot of these are issues that we should actually start putting in place in the manner in which we look at, okay, this is the way we're going to progress. And I think Korea had a plan. I think Japan had a plan, had a sequence. I think China, most importantly, as specifically, certain speakers have pointed out, had a sequence in mind, low value add initially, but getting to critical mass, things like that. So there is a strategy on what China did. I would say that it was not, for all of these countries that have come up, it's not been purely accidental or chance. There's been a strategy. And I think for us to have a strategy, for improving India's competitiveness and improving its economic growth, I think is critical. And a strategy, as I've said again, is not just having a destination, but having the sequence and having the focus. Okay, this is what we're going to do first, and this is what we're going to do next. And I think infrastructure, of course, comes high up on the list for multiple reasons. But that's sort of the key point that I would make, and I would love to see. It's on my wish list for the white paper that I went through, that if each of these is sort of visited. Now, two things that I'd like to say, that is, I'm not finding fault with actual throwing. I'm not actually finding fault with setting out that number, or that where do we want to get to. I'd call that a vision. So when someone throws out a number, like $5 trillion economy, or someone comes up with 111 lakh crore infrastructure, national infrastructure pipeline. While some might say, that's just throwing something out, I actually believe that there is tremendous value to doing that. And the value to doing that is that unless you know where you want to get to, it's going to be difficult to see what's required to get there. So even that national infrastructure pipeline, when we look at the 111 lakh crores, to actually have a sectoral breakdown of where it's going to happen, this broad division that 40% central government, 40% state government, 20% private sector, all of that. When you throw that out for the first time on a sectoral basis, it actually provides you with what I would call the sandbox to play with. Before you actually put these numbers out, and before you actually have something to respond to, everyone is just doing things in the way it's been done, a little bit faster, a little bit less, and those allocations, that have national infrastructure pipeline. It's actually giving you something that you can play with. These don't have to be set in stone, but it tells you, starts helping people think about, okay, if that's where we've got to get to, this is what has to happen to the financial system, this is what has to happen to the bond market, this is what has to happen to the credit system, this is what has to happen to the amount of steel that the country requires. So all of that starts providing very, very broad benchmarks. And I think the process that has been followed in at least Japan and Korea early on in their development sort of looked at some of this, not just at a domestic scale, but also looked at it at a global scale. And these are critical factors. China is a different story. I won't go into that anymore. But this, Pradeep, this is what I wanted to sort of just give in terms of my inputs. If the white paper could discuss scale, and scale doesn't necessarily mean, again, let me repeat, the overall country size in one particular industry relative to the globe, because it's also the structure of that industry. You can have a country which is the same size as in 1,000 players. So, if you look at it from that perspective, you're talking about scale of actual enterprise, of each enterprise within that industry. So I'll stop with that. And hopefully those are things that, I'd love to see them. If it doesn't happen, doesn't matter.
Ajit, just one question from the audience, if you would like to address, is how important are agriculture reforms to broaden competition?
So I think they're tremendously important. I think I've already highlighted that we are almost 2 orders of magnitude away from the best in class in agricultural competitiveness. That as per the last census, 43% of our workforce is engaged in agriculture, where best practices is less than 1% of those countries. So clearly, in terms of competitiveness, we are way behind over there. The second is these agricultural reforms from a market perspective. When you talk about markets, so far the markets have been defined at a state level because of all the channels that we have had. In fact, some of the greatest resistance that has happened right now to the APMC, et cetera, has been to actually break up those markets from these smaller, tight, small markets into a bigger national market to bring efficiencies there. So a lot of the, the 3 Farm Acts, in fact, or reforms, just beyond these 3 Farm Acts, bringing reform to agriculture, which I regard as probably the single biggest weakness this country has in terms of its competitiveness. The cost burden, if you have a look at inflation in this country and you look at the CPI, almost 50% of that CPI index is, contributed to by food. And if that 50% we are so inefficient at, then you're basically hamstringing the entire financial system, because if that inflation keeps going up because of our inefficiencies, you're hamstringing the amount of credit that can pump into the overall system because of our, being watchful on inflation. If we bring that 50% just through efficiencies down over time, if we're managing that 50%, so there's, instead of 0% inflation in food, we actually have negative inflation because the cost of food production is so high. Can you imagine that India, from being one of the lowest leveraged in the last large economies, out of all the large economies in the world today, the private leverage in India is among the lowest. That private leverage can be a huge driver of growth, well into double digits for a couple of decades. But to manage that right, agriculture is so critical because of the massive contribution to inflation, massive contribution to the wage of the base earner in India. It's such a significant part of his expense pool that inefficiency leads to everything, whether it's a manufacturing, whether it's a services, all other sectors. So I think it is a most critical factor. I think we've got to make much more progress than just these 3 Farm Acts over there. And if we are successful in doing that over time, a large number of the other sort of things can fall in place quite well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ajit. That was an excellent response to this question about how important are agricultural reforms to broader competitiveness. Let me go back to the points which you made about Japan and Korea. I mean, the kind of industrial policy they followed in 70s and 80s was shut down ever since the WTO came into being. And even both Japan and Korea realized that the domestic competition had weakened tremendously, in spite of the fact that they had a number of players in each sector. And they did protect them from external forces. But what they found was that the increasing concentration within their own economy led to all kinds of malpractices and market failures, with the result that both Japan and Korea today have very, very tough competition laws. And in fact, Korea had took it so seriously that the first chairman of the FTC was even made a member of the cabinet. The realization that the country had, that the industrial policy we followed, to put it in a very simple manner, that we would not have had a Milkha Singh or a Sachin Tendulkar if they had not competed domestically in order to be able to compete globally. So I don't think that strategy of following Japan and Korea's model is anyway relevant any longer or even worthwhile pursuing.
Just one clarification there, Pradeep. When you're talking about the Sachin Tendulkars and you're talking about the Milka thing, you're talking about individual talent. When we are talking about the competition, market share, and lack of competitiveness, etc., all we are saying is something slightly different. We are talking about relative scale of enterprise to compete globally. So, for example, Korea is an island nation, small economy, limited population. In an environment like Korea, which is today, you're absolutely right, there's the pendulum has swung in the other direction after it's created players at a global scale. There was no way that if you had 3 players together under 50% market share in every sector, that any Korean player could have been a global leader in the manner in which it is, whether it's a Samsung, whether it's an LG, whether it's a Hyundai, whether when you look at it. What happened is based on sequence of development of a country and sequence of development of an economy. If you have a look at the same structure, if I were to ask you in India in textiles, which is one speaker mentioned, if you take the same size of industry and you divide, instead of having 10,000 players, if you had 100 players in that industry, I can tell you that the efficiencies of that industry, maybe you divide them equally, all of that everywhere, the efficiencies of that industry would increase tremendously because there is scale, the minimum scale at the enterprise level. So when we look at structures, that's why I said the structure matters as well. The structure of that industry matters, but we mustn't forget that the markets today are global. They are not domestic alone. And if you're sitting with folks that are pushing trade and saying that international trade has to increase, which I'm all for, then they've got to be looking at it from how do our Indian enterprises become effective at a global level. And if you're very focused on the domestic market for scale of enterprise, you're not talking about in other ways, in that domestic market for scale of enterprise and ensuring that they're highly fragmented, your capital formation of this country will slow down. That is the case that we're making.
Let me extend the analogy of Sachin Tendulkar to not only cricket but football, etc., etc. What we have now done is through these leagues are getting foreign players to come and play in India on the soil with the domestic players and thus build up the capacity of domestic players. We are doing that in the industry as well. Mobile phones, as you gave an example, we are getting a lot of foreign enterprise coming in, including Indian enterprises going ahead with being helped by PLI, etc., etc. But the point what I'm trying to make is competitiveness can come through competition, but how you strategize this competition is not necessarily following a discarded model, a old-fashioned model of Japan and Korea. That will be a disaster. It's a debate that we are discussing globally on industrial policy versus competition policy, and naturally competition policy will prevail. With that, may I now request Manoj Panda? Manoj, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Pradeep. Now, the title of the series of the webinar is Improving India's Competitiveness for Inclusive Economic Growth. And inclusiveness has been discussed from several angles, from size of the industry, from different skills, gender, and so on. I would like to slightly go to a different angle, namely the province. Given the substantive heterogeneity of India across states and union territories, obviously one policy may not suit all. And what we identify as a competitive sector at the national level, that sector may not be able to grow in different states. In a sense, a state is not just a scaled down version of a national policy and competition. Each state, they have their own structural features, demographic, social groups, level of development, of course. And Also, some of the states have different market focus, whether it is domestic or external. Now, given that, and also given the overall understanding that now the focus of growth is also shifting, the center of gravity of growth policies is shifting towards the states, I think we need to discuss more in terms of what is happening at the state level, how to develop competitiveness there. And we have been speaking of cooperative federalism. Now, how do we make the states competitive in their own, according to their own area of say, core competencies? Because some states might have large mineral sector, some others may have a large base of skilled manpower, and so on. So according to their own endowment structure, according to their own competencies, how do we make them? Yeah. And I think here, I will say that developing an index of ranking of states by competitiveness, not necessarily just the overall competitiveness, but by 3 or 4 major attributes. That might be very useful for policy purpose and to encourage competition. At times, when we talk of state competitiveness, the center sends one signal, it talks of one India, one market. At the same time, we see now that some of the states, they have been restricting their input market by virtue of quotas. Now, this sends a confusing signal to the public. Are we in for competition, or we are just letting some of the people not to bother so much for competition? Or how do we reconcile? I do agree that there will be some trade-offs as we move forward and as we take different states into confidence. But if the trade-offs are very high, then obviously the question arises in the public mind about the consistency of the policy. I think I would also like to bring one more aspect that I was talking of, the indices. The Asia Competitiveness Institute at the LKY school in Singapore, last few years, they have been developing competitiveness index for various Indian states, and they have been bringing out with their annual reports. Those indices, conceptually, possibly one might agree or disagree with them. For example, whether it is input-based indices or output-based indices, those are different. There might be differences at the conceptual level, and the LKY schools, ACI, they try to take even output as one of the components of competitiveness, namely GDP growth, and so on. That might be, but there is, what we need is much more conceptually, much more clear understanding of what should be included when we measure competitiveness across states, and whether we can do such exercises to create an intertemporal profile so that states can compete, they can know where they are. And secondly, what is also necessary is, if some of the states find that they are at the bottom end of the ranking, how much improvement can they expect in their index if they suppose they raise it to by certain percentage, by 20 or 30%? I think those kind of policy analysis also will help the states to focus on few factors which will increase their competitiveness. I do agree with the earlier speakers that competitiveness ultimately it cannot be just judged by the domestic economy. Ultimately, we have to compete in the international economy, and we cannot give different signals uh, for the uh, export market. The tariffs, even if the average tariff rate might not have gone up so much, average in the sense of collection rate as a percentage of total import. In some of the sectors, possibly they have been raised quite a bit, and that might be protecting the sector from external market. And a protection for infant industry, one can understand that, but for sectors which have already been there for such a long time, now we have to leave it to them to compete in the international market with competitive tariff. Having told that, I'll also add one more thing, given the earlier discussion, that to reduce poverty, you need growth. And if growth is poverty reducing, so also trade-led growth. On the inequality front, the story might be somewhat different, but then we all of us recognize that there could be a trade-off between growth and inequality. The question ultimately is whether different sections of the people are benefiting from it for inclusiveness, and possibly if growth is reducing poverty, that is the best indicator of inclusiveness, not necessarily inequality as such. I think the other point I would like to also focus is on the subsidy regime. Obviously, there are limits to subsidy, and the best policy for reducing poverty is to empower people through employment opportunities. But here, I think given the trend in employment, GDP elasticities in different countries in the last few years, one is worried that even if we have 7 or 8% growth, we may not be able to employ everybody. I think it is this aspect that needs to be tackled soon, and otherwise there might be problems from the social stability point of view. A large number of unemployed people, it's not a good thing for the society. An idle mind is a devil's workshop. Otherwise, we may have to spend quite a bit by taking money from the sectors or from the enterprises that are growing on people who are unemployed and go for some kind of unemployment allowance or what people have been talking about as universal basic income, which I personally think we are possibly not in a situation where we can adopt universal basic income, but unemployment allowances might be possible, or alternatively, we may have to think of like the rural employment guarantee program, urban employment guarantee programs also. But then the question comes, which sectors? For rural area it is easy, but for urban area it is not that easy. I think these are some of the issues which I thought I'll focus on.
No, I'm glad you mentioned these, except that we wanted a little more focused discussion on competitiveness, knowing that the other issues are equally important. But we often discuss too many flanking issues without coming to the real focus or foci, as it were. And I'm glad that Ajit Pai at least went through the white paper and made clear comments on how the white paper could be improved. Now we have about 10 minutes left, and I would now request each of the panelists to speak about it. One question which has come from the audience, and which even Montek mentioned, is what are your views on India's position on Rsip, and whether this is a missed opportunity to create jobs and improve competitiveness? Can I start with you, Manoj, on this question?
Yes,
Precisely, precisely.
You know, I do think that we should have joined Rsip with a, maybe with a better timeline to compete. We could have bargained on that. And the main reason why I'm telling we should have joined Rsip is possibly about the countries which have joined Rsip. They will be accounting for about half the GDP of the world. And we cannot leave that out. The alternative to that is, if we don't join a group like that, we have to negotiate with each, some of the major players in that group. And that might be even costlier than negotiating with the group as a whole.
Thank you very much. Rajat?
Hi, thanks, Pradeep. No, I think, between the lines, if you heard what I said earlier, it
Yes.
is an opportunity that we have lost, not only for economic reasons, but for, I think, geopolitical reasons. I think
That's what Montaigne said.
Sorry?
Even then, Montaigne said the same thing.
Yes, and I think that, if our objective, and when you're looking at RCEP, you're not looking at only trade flows. I think you're looking also at investment flows. And I think for India, what is important today, if you want to become a participant in global value chains, is investment flows. And a lot of investment, if you see, are coming from East Asian countries into India. And that could have been facilitated if we were a part of RCEP. Not that they wouldn't come in now, but they could have been facilitated much better if we had become a part of RCEP. Naturally, there are trade-offs in terms of our impact on manufacturing, especially the fear of China. And I think Manoj said it really well, is that if there are industries that you've already received infant industry protection and now you're competing with the world, you don't want to sort of use political economy to try and get yourself protected from international competition. And I think Indian industry, I don't know whether you will agree with it or not, I think Indian industry sort of underestimates its ability to compete globally. Of course, there are handicaps, and we recognize, all of us have talked about handicaps, and Ajayji, knows all about it and has written extensively about the handicaps we face and how we can overcome. But I think, necessity is the mother of invention. 91, there was a Bombay Club. And I think if we had given into the Bombay Club, we would not have been able to develop our auto industry, our pharmaceutical industry, our services industry that we see are globally competitive today. And I think RCEP could have become that instrument, that trigger to spread competitiveness across several other industries that need to become competitive. So RCEP, I think India can still join the RCEP, and I think we should. And sometimes the fear of China overwhelming our manufacturing industry, and New Zealand and Australia overwhelming our dairy industry. Sometimes I think those fears tend to be overplayed. And I think they're sort of easy to ask for protection, more difficult to compete.
No, I agree with you. I think, as I had explained to you, the Prime Minister's statement on Atmanirbharta and global value chains, what he meant by Atmanirbharta was self-confidence, and which is what our industry is lacking. And that was one reason why we could not enter RCEP. And he said that in a way that people could understand. Ajay?
Am I audible? Yes.
Yeah.
Am I visible? Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me begin with an anecdote, because this issue of RCEP and protectionism, etc., is very two strong views on two opposing sides, let me put it like this. So I have had the privilege of being part of, with Rajat for many years, a track 2 interaction with the Koreans. So over one cocktail late in the evening, a very elderly Korean said that, because we were saying how open we are to FDI trade, etc., etc., he said quietly that we were closed to trade, till we created global champions. And if you recall the US 301 law, the biggest chapters for years after years used to be on Korea and Japan. Then they said that now that we have global champions, we are thinking of becoming open to investment. And there's an interview of the owner of Daewoo, which I once read in my travels in a plane journey to either Fortune or Forbes, saying that when they had the 98 crisis, the crisis should not have hit them because they were doing well, but being interconnected globally to Asia, they also had a severe crisis and go to the IMF and World Bank. So the IMF and World Bank wanted them to demolish their 4 chaebols. There are 4 or 5. Samsung, Hyundai, Daewoo, etc. And the Daewoo owner, promoter who was then bankrupt, had been interviewed, and he said the Korean government took a strategic decision to sacrifice my chaebol to save the others and preserve them. The key difference between East Asians and us of the old days, pre-91, was that the only criterion that the East Asian governments took, that was Japan, Korea, and later China, that you will get all the support you need as long as you succeed in the export market. So we keep reading that this export from China is below cost, or the banking system should be going bankrupt, but the state drove success by saying, the only way I recognize you as successful is if you succeed in the export market. And then the sky is the limit. Now, because we were a continental size economy, took the view that we can be self-reliant in the way the erstwhile Soviet Union was. And so we became technologically evolved, large manufacturing base, but completely non-competitive. So going forward, as I would repeat what I had said earlier, that we need a very clear-headed game plan for achieving global competitiveness in sectors where we think we can create the maximum jobs to begin with, then have a guide map, and as Nirmala Sitharamanji said in a budget speech, that we will use import duties after good stakeholder consultation as an instrument for promoting manufacturing. And I come back to my first point, you get the real exchange rate right, and get the other inputs right, you may not need too much of tweaking of import duties. Final point is, China became the factory of the world in 2000. It was clear it was becoming the factory of the world by 2000. Till then, it was not even a member of the WTO. And it got membership with all kinds of restrictions. So let us succeed in creating global champions. Let us succeed in manufacturing. And I also like to add that each of the East Asians entered Western or developed country markets at the lowest price point and grew market share from negligible 2%, 4%, 5%. So that market space is available to us in abundance across the manufacturing spectrum, because we would be entering the global market trying to get a bit of the market share which China has and is vacating, or could vacate, because we would be cheaper and better in quality. So I think we need to look at it in a more pragmatic way as what is likely to work in India, then look at it through the prism of infant industry protection on the one hand, or openness to trade on the other.
Ajay, what is your...
And the FTAs that we've had.
Can I ask you a specific question?
Yeah.
On Rsip, was it right or wrong?
I think it was right, and I think we should stay out till we get our internal act together in lowering the cost of it.
Thank you. Ajit?
So specifically on the Rsip question, I think the decision that we made was the right decision. I think in what I would say more, even more significantly than giving us an opportunity to actually catch up in certain ways, I think the most significant thing that the world, and especially in the world of competition, when you're looking at competition in the way you defined it, that the world has not appreciated sufficiently, is that China is not a market economy. And when we say it's not a market economy, I'm just pointing to the massive risk that has gotten exposed during COVID-19, that in certain categories, China has 65 to 70% global market share. So the country, while it's, from the outside, it appears to be adhering to these competition rules, all of that, it's competing through creating an enabling environment. the number one steel company in the world is not a Chinese company. Today, 57% of all steel capacity in the world is based in China, producing capacity, right? It had gone up to sort of the low 60s, not too far back. So when you have state-sponsored strategies, like we talked about, that's why I said I was talking about Japan, talking about Korea, but I was not mentioning China in specific. We are looking at steel share that is greater than 50% for an economy that is 1/3 that size of the percent of the world. We are talking about aluminum that is north of 50%. We are talking about API share of more than 50%. So we are creating huge risk from a risk perspective to the global economy by allowing China to get these, state-sponsored prices that are actually not true market prices. They are state-sponsored prices that are well below market prices. Until the world appreciates that, middle of last year in June, you had the EU win a judgment against China for saying that China is not a market economy. Now, when you join Rsip, which is a trade body which allows free trade between these countries, some of the countries over there, while it might appear on the surface that they are not necessarily in the same bed or in the same side as China, if you look at their overall trade to GDP ratios, as we approach 60%, we are looking at countries that are already at 130%. A large amount of goods from China with very limited value add, I know that there are rules to value add, all of that, are going through these countries. For example, if you look at a Vietnam, you look at all of that, that is a rising competition for India. And they will land up in India competing with Indian businesses that are already getting opened up to the world at a very steady pace. So my sense is that until the world, the WTO as an organization has not been able to effectively, I think it woke up too late to this China risk, both in terms of global concentration risk. I don't think it's safe for the world to have so much exposure to some of the critical foundational blocks of the global economy in a single nation, especially one that's not a democracy and that's not free market, right? So they were sleeping at the wheel. The WTO was sleeping at the wheel. In this kind of environment, for India to be taking a risk to put its domestic player and its domestic market to this player, whether it comes directly from China or through other countries, I think was premature. And while I would support that we need to, we're taking steps to ensure that we improve, some of those, the infrastructure, the energy, the labor laws, all of that. We're taking several steps to make India more efficient. I think that the primary reason why we should have delayed our entry and why I support that delay in entry is that we've got to figure out how to deal with China, and China is a very important part of this big block. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I make one short comment? Pradeep, may I make one short comment?
Yeah.
We would gain much more if we had or pick up the threads of the FTA with Europe and push it through, because then there is genuine complementarity.
I completely agree. I think.
And we get duty-free access to textile and garments.
No, Ajay, fortunately, the government of India is working on it.
I do hope they do it, because the last...
but not, I mean, they've spoken about US, but with US, there are too many red lines.
The US, there is no appetite politically and otherwise, but
no, not at all. And even with EU, our biggest red line is the social standards.
I think we should accept it. Because my view is that we should position ourselves as being globally green and globally responsible and have a competitive advantage vis-a-vis China.
It's a little murky.
I mean, I attended the last review meeting taken on this by the then Prime Minister.
Right.
And to me, the gulfs were minor and could have been overcome. And
but see, with Rsip, one factor which none of you speak about is the trade diversion which is happening. We're losing a lot of our existing market, because it is easier for partners to work together rather than with a non-partner country. Anyway, Shamika?
Anyway, I won't debate this further. Okay.
Manoj, I'll come to you.
I have 2 points. One is Atmanirbhar Bharat. The way it is in, Prime Minister possibly is putting it in a different way. He is putting, he wants India to be in the global scene and all that. But the way the industry or the ministries of different governments, different departments, they are interpreting anything that is produced in India and import is substituted, they think it is Atmanirbhar Bharat. I think that is a wrong interpretation.
Yeah.
One has to, Atmavishwas will
Vocal
come
for
if we are able
local.
to. Atmavishwas will come if we are able to pay for the imports. The
Exactly.
second point is on the export front, Rsip or not, anyway, government has decided. But what I would stress still is the export growth cannot be neglected. If we neglect export growth and we depend only on large size of our own domestic market, I'm afraid we may not be able to grow more than 5%.
I agree with you, Manoj. And this is my very considered opinion to all the panelists, is that export growth is a driver for domestic competitiveness. Anywhere, everywhere. I mean, history shows it. Over to you, Shamika.
Yeah. So broadly, well, I think it was pragmatic. I will not say it was great, but it was definitely the pragmatic decision to stay out of Rsip. The details, Pradeep, sometimes it's a little bit like without seeing the details of the negotiation sector by sector. All we hear about is the milk aspect of it. The diversion is now limited to certain sectors. You see, these kind of large comprehensive trade agreements rest on, lots of empirical truths. And when you talk only in theory, and as I think a lot of times, Arvind does, Panagaria, I think theoretically I agree. I think openness has been good and so on and so forth. But these are not times for theoretical arguments, unfortunately. And I think as Mr. Ajay Shankar made it clear, and this was my earlier point, almost all leading economies, America, Germany, Korea, Japan, and now latest China, they have all been closed economies. But when they have been protectionist, they have produced world-class industry. The problem has been that in the first 40 years of protected sort of an environment, economy that we had, it did not lead to the kind of global sort of, players. And therefore, the fear of protectionism today is a real fear. It's not an abstract fear. But most of the time when people are concerned, it's like, why will economy, why will certain aspects of industry now become competitive when they have not been in the past? And I think that is why bringing in elements of competition, even if it is not export, I'm saying you need competition even internally for the domestic markets also. Competition has to be promoted as a policy instrument, as a form of regulatory, principle. Also, it's a bit of a chicken and egg, right? I mean, we know WTO today, the largest number of disputes countries have is vis-a-vis China. So we know that there are problems the way China has also opened its economy. And are we in a position to do the same? With respect to Europe, we have been negotiating now the FTA with Europe for the last 20 years, Pradeep.
I know.
It also speaks about what is the administrative capacity to enter such trade agreement. How much capacity does our government have to get into such details? Let's not wish away these kind of constraints, because these are, these are real constraints. The third point, Ajit made a very important point on scale, that we don't have the scale. But remember, scale is also an outcome. Scale is an outcome of policy instruments as well.
Yeah.
Right? And now just one statistics, because I just finished writing a paper on this. Scale and degree of competition should be gauged for those industries, firms which are competing globally. But that competition is important also internally when their competition is within for the domestic market itself. The average size of a higher education institution in India, 690 students per higher education institution. China's scale is 16,000. And this is just an average college. Just the way we have traditionally grown, and that's where the element of scale, unfortunately, across sectors in India, we have hit ceiling, which is very premature. A lot of it had to do with the fact that, labor has been expensive on account of the kind of rules we had in the past, hoping that the new reforms will bring about a greater change. But also, they have, the capital constraint, just the kind of definitions we have had. We know the data is very clear. There is so much bunching of firms around small and medium. They just don't want to move to the next scale because it brings in a whole host of regulatory burden. So that's what I mean, that, there is an element of policy, and the way we have defined and the benefits that come by being small in India have also led to a kind of a distortion whereby we have firms which have remained small. So again, it's a chicken and egg. We can't, look at it only from one side. You need to have a comprehensive view. Thank you.
Oh, Shamika and Ajit, this is a very valid point and has been raised by us and by many others for a long time. But we have a peculiar warp within our country in terms of thinking as well as action. That is, I would like to see that informal sector remains informal rather than to grow. That may I come to Preetham. Preetham,
Thank you.
Rsip.
I think it was a good decision. I think Ajit Pai has made the right comment. China's and the detailed analysis have been provided now across the world about the distortion that the Chinese government brings. And that brings me to the second point. India has comprehensive agreements with almost every other large economy that is there in the Rsip except Australia. There is nothing that stops us from deepening those ties. That's point number one. So we should not have diversion if we had deepen our agreements with ASEAN
If we deepen, yeah.
and all of that, and there's nothing stopping us from doing it. The second point is that if you look at the structure, and that goes back to Dr. Ravi's point about the negotiation details, our major gains were in services. None of the Southeast Asian countries or China were willing to make any sort of meaningful commitment on the services side. Yet, why are we being defensive? They were the ones who refused to open their markets in the core area of interest for India. That's not a negotiation I would like to be a part of. So I think, given that context, it was the right decision.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With that, we come to an end for this discussion. We are already running 14 minutes over time. May I request Bipul Chatterjee, my dear colleague, to summarize or not summarize. Don't summarize.
Thank you, and that's a good suggestion actually. So I will not make any attempt to summarize this rich discussion. We have made a note of them. So other than thanking all of you, let me underline the point which Mr. Mehta has made in the beginning, that we have drafted a white paper taking into account all these points and also the two catalytic papers. We're going to refine it and send it back to you for your comments and feedback. And I would really request you, all of you, to send your feedback on that second or third revision of that white paper. All I would say, I think at the macro level, we have all policies in place except the logistics policy and the competition policy. And today's discussion has clearly underlined the need for having those policies. But the real issue is at the micro level or at the granular level, I would say. We have to get state governments and local governments involved in this drive for our competitiveness to become more competitive, I would say. So with that, on that note, I hope that we are on the verge of entering our 75th year of our independence. So this would be one major agenda item on the 75th anniversary of our independence. And I'm sure that...
Thank you very much. It was an excellent discussion, I must say that. And we hope that we'll be able to distill it into something which can be an actionable paper. And that is what would be our biggest challenge. And as Bipul said, may I request you earnestly, each of you, including I see Ashima Goel and Vidisha Ganguly, who had been in part of this webinar series earlier, to please comment on it to see to it that we are able to come out with a clear document, something which we can use and pursue the government, and particularly take the help of Ajit Pai, who's here from the Niti Aayog, and one of our great well-wishers and I mean country's well-wishers, to take it forward through the policy circles within the government in order to see as to how can be done. And as was said by, I think it was Montego somebody, sequencing, or it is Ajit. Sorry, Ajit, you said sequencing, and that sequencing would be very important. So what we'll give you is a paper with the kind of sequence that, look, these are the things which should be done. It could be low-hanging fruits, it could be little, needs a little ladder, needs a long ladder, and so on, and come to that and see as to how we can progress on that. Let me also thank you all once again, and hoping to hear from you through the discussion that we've had on the draft white paper. Thank you very much. Have a good day.